Representatives from over 100 parties to the Paris Agreement gathered in Bonn, Germany for the Bonn Climate Change Conference that was held from 5th to 15th of June 2023. This was the 58th session of the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice, which is the SBSTA, and the Scientific Body for Implementation, which is the SBI under the UNFCCC. This year's conference was built on the mandates that emerged from COP27 last year in Egypt and will be seen as a precursor to COP28 that will be held in Dubai this year. I spoke to my colleagues from the climate program, Subrata Chakrabarty, Ashwini Hingne, and Saransh Bajpai, who were present in Bonn and participated in the conference. They will talk about their perspectives on what happened and also discuss the way forward as we draw closer to COP28. Let me direct my first question to you, Ashwini. Could you please elaborate on what were the items on the agenda that were a point of contention and what was the final outcome?
One of the reasons for delay in adopting the agenda was the inclusion of the Mitigation, Ambition and Implementation Work Program, which is short form is MWP. So including that as an agenda item was agreed by all the parties at COP27. And the implementation was expected to start immediately. Under this program, it was also decided that at least 2 global dialogues will be held with a focus on investment every year until 2026. And the first dialogue was held in conjunction with the SB58, which was at Bonn. Now, while the EU requested the inclusion of the MWP, G77 and China requested the inclusion of national adaptation plans. Now, parties could not reach a consensus, and therefore the agenda was not adopted on the first day of this subsidiary body. Now, the matters were further complicated when LMDC or like-minded developing countries proposed the inclusion of an additional agenda item, which was urgent scaling up of financial support from developed country parties, which was referring to the Article 4.5 of the Paris Agreement. Now, the inclusion of the MWP was not acceptable to the LMDCs and a few other supporting countries, especially without a new finance track. The EU and the developed parties blocked and opposed the proposal by the LMDCs to include finance, which they said was already part of the mitigation work program, and therefore an additional track was not required. Now, this is what created the deadlock, and finally that the agenda that was adopted by the parties on the second last day of the proceedings was one where the MWP as well as the additional finance track both were dropped, and just one clause was added, which was that the work that was carried out under the mitigation work program will be captured through an informal note and will be released by the subsidiary body chairs. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashwin. My next question is for you, Saransh. So last year's COP, which was held in Egypt, led to the establishment of a loss and damage fund to compensate the most vulnerable countries for damages from climate-related disasters. Now, at this COP, it was also decided to operationalize the Santiago network. Given that loss and damage is one of the agenda items at the Bonn Climate Change Conference, what were some of the key developments and what does the road ahead look like?
Thanks, Steffi. So before moving to the response, let us understand what the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage is. It was established at COP25 in Madrid in 2019 to catalyze the technical assistance of relevant organizations, bodies, networks, and experts for the implementation of relevant approaches at the local, national, and regional level in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. At COP26 in Glasgow, parties elaborated on this, agreeing to 6 functions for the Santiago network. These included, for example, to assist in identifying and communicating technical assistance needs and priorities, and actively connecting those seeking technical assistance with best suited organizations. One of the major outcomes on loss and damage at COP27 included the establishment of institutional arrangements for Santiago network to enable its full operationalization. It was also decided that the Santiago network will have a hosted secretariat to facilitate its work, an advisory board to provide guidance, and a network of member organizations, bodies, networks, and experts. Following a call for proposals to serve as host agency issued by the UNFCCC Secretariat on 31st December last year, 2 proponents submitted proposals as of 31st March 2023, which was the deadline. The Caribbean Development Bank and a United Nations consortium composed of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which we know as UNDRR, and the UN Office for Project Services, UNOPS. An evaluation panel was established to assess these proposals based on the evaluation criteria, with its report being circulated just before the start of SB58. The SBs were mandated to prepare a draft decision for consideration during COP28 in Dubai to approve the selection of the host agency secretariat. However, due to the failure to select the host agency, the SB58 came out with procedural conclusions, simply noting that parties considered this issue, they deliberated on this issue, and agreed to continue discussing this issue at SB59 for being endorsed by COP28 in Dubai. The failure to select a host agency at SB58 means further delay of at least 1.5 years from SB58, that is June this year, in the operationalization of the Santiago network for loss and damage. Thanks.
Thanks, Saransh. My next question is for Subrata. So 2023 is going to be an important year because the first global stocktake will take place at COP28 in Dubai. Can you please explain what global stocktake is and also what has happened since the Paris Agreement, and also discuss the contentious issues regarding the overall framework?
Thank you, Steffi. The global stocktake is basically a process to evaluate the progress made by the countries to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, build resilience to climate impacts, and secure the finance and support to address the climate risk. It is now an established fact through various reports that the countries are not on track to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees C with the current ambitions. So the success of COP28 will lie in its ability to agree to a course correction and ratchet up ambition to meet the ultimate objective of the Paris Agreement. So far, there has been 3 global dialogues on GST. At SB58, the draft framework for the GST was published, which consists of 5 sections: preamble, context and cross-cutting sections, achieving the purpose and the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement, enhancing international cooperation, and the way forward. Now, the third part, that is the collective purpose and the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement, was the most debated part, and more so because it included subsections on the financial flows and the means of implementation. Towards this end, the historic responsibility of the developed parties formed the basis of disagreements. The co-chair basically proposed a compromise, and the final text included all the options suggested by the parties with respect to the financial flows and the means of implementation. The summary note on the third GST technical dialogue will be out by 15th August 2023, and a synthesis report will be produced well before COP28. Thanks.
Thanks, Subrata. Ashwini, so another significant outcome from COP27 was the establishment of a just transition work program. And negotiators at Bonn were tasked with fleshing out its scope. Take us through what happened and also what was the stance of developing and developed nations?
Thanks, Steffi. You're right. So at COP27, parties decided to establish the Just Transition Work Program. The goal of this work program is to help achieve the goals of Paris Agreement in a just and equitable manner, and to also convene annual high-level ministerial roundtables on just transition, and the first one of which is actually supposed to take place at COP28. Now, the focus of the discussions at Bonn were to agree upon what would be the objective of this work program, what could be the scope, what would be the institutional arrangement for this program, how does it link to the UNFCCC processes, what would be the modalities be, and also what are the inputs and the outcomes for the work program. Now, the way the proceedings happened, there were several rounds of inputs that parties gave to the Secretariat on what they expect on each of these parameters. The Secretariat then put together an informal note, which was then further deliberated upon. To get to the specifics, we don't have a final decision yet because there were clear divergences between developed and developing countries. Now, there were some parties, which is mostly developed countries, including United States, United Kingdom, European Union, and others, who looked at this work program with a much more narrower focus that looked at transitioning the workforce from in the energy sector, and that doesn't really go much beyond sharing experiences and best practices and then reporting on these best practices with other parties. Now, the developing countries, on the other hand, which includes countries from the G77 plus China, look at this work program with a much broader scope, which focuses on uh, impacts of a low carbon transition beyond just the energy sector and beyond just the workforce, including indirect and induced impacts. And they are looking at this work program to go beyond just knowledge sharing, to create avenues for ensuring sustainable development, technology transfer, and of course, financial support to enable a just energy transition and enhance energy access across the world. Now, the second key divergence was on the objective of the Just Transition Work Program. So here, while developed countries clearly express that they see just transition to be an enabler for strong climate ambition, developing countries with growth ahead of them rejected any implication of the Just Transition Work Program to be another means to push ambition or to prescribe parties on how to achieve their mitigation commitments. According to developing countries, the objective of the work program must be to support a low carbon transition in a way that does not exacerbate the existing inequities within as well as between countries, and that does not hamper the achievement of economic aspirations and sustainable development of developing countries. And they don't want the program to be prescriptive or punitive in nature. And developing countries essentially demand a long-term program that delivers annual decisions, while developed countries want a program that pretty much ends in the next 3 years. What we have at the end of this process is, of course, these divergent views that are put together in an informal note, which will inform further discussions before the COP, which will be in the form of a workshop that the Secretariat will organize, including broad participation of parties as well as observers. So that's all from the Just Transition Work Program. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Ashwini. Subrata, this is my question for you. Climate finance seems to be the big point of contention in climate politics. In 2015, a new collective quantified goal, or the NCQG, was mandated by the Paris Agreement, which has to be agreed upon at COP29, which will be held in 2024. Last year, there was no concrete outcome on climate finance at COP27. Do you think that the Bonn conference helped advance this discussion? And also, will this topic resurface at COP28?
Thanks, Steffi. Let me divide this answer between what is happening within the UNFCCC process and what is happening outside of UNFCCC process, because there has been a lot of developments that happened in past 3 weeks. Within UNFCCC process, as far as this new collective quantified goal on climate finance is concerned, the technical dialogue commenced wherein UNFCCC Executive Secretary called for bold and creative thoughts to unlock required finance to meet the objective of the Paris Agreement. Interestingly, the discussion on the finance really flared up during the second week, uh, in few other work streams apart from finance. And the tussle between Article 2.1c and Article 9 was quite evident in a few negotiating agenda items. While Article 2.1c requires parties to align the financial flows consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, Article 9 of the Paris Agreement calls out developed countries to provide the required finance to the developing countries. The focus of the developed countries on Article 2.1c is seen as an excuse by the developing countries to escape the obligation of their financial commitments. Besides, a few developing countries whose economy is heavily reliant on the fossil fuel industries would like to keep the narrative fixated on Article 9, because aligning the financial flows with the pathways towards a low carbon economy essentially hints towards the phasing out of the fossil fuels. Therefore, COP28 will be crucial to see how the decisions on the climate finance pan out for these various agenda items, such as mitigation work program, just transition work program, loss and damage, etc. Outside the UNFCCC process, what many experts called a watershed moment is this new global financing pact summit 2023, which recently concluded in Paris. A few concrete but mixed measures have been agreed upon at the summit. For example, there are at least 52 countries that are in debt distress because of the impact of COVID and the current stress developed by the climate disasters. The World Bank has agreed to pause debt repayments for countries struggling with climate disaster only on the new loans and not on the existing loans. Similarly, the UK, France, and United States, Spain, Barbados, the World Bank Group, and the Inter-American Development Bank launched a call to action to bilateral, multilateral, and private sector creditors, uh, to include climate resilient debt clauses by the end of 2025, with a group of early movers offering the clause by COP28. Japan, UK, and France pledged varying proportion of their special drawing rights to poor countries to the tune of 80 billion US dollars. In addition, an amount of 21 billion US dollars could also come from United States, taking the total to a little above 100 billion US dollars. And this is separate from the usual 100 billion US dollar mobilization that we speak about when we talk about the UNFCCC process and the climate goals. Cote d'Ivoire and France have agreed to a debt reduction and development contract with 1.14 billion euros of Ivorian bilateral debt, which will be converted into grants to finance various development projects. A just transition partnership has been established between Senegal and G7 countries, which was also the splash in the media to support Senegal's transition to renewable by 40% of its generation mix by 2030. Senegal also secured 2.5 billion US dollar from bilateral donors, multilateral development banks, and the private sector to support this transition. Lastly, the World Bank announced the launch of a process to better integrate the impact of climate finance in adaptation and the mitigation efforts in the new projects, and also launched private sector investment lab that will facilitate the private sector to invest in renewable energy and energy infrastructure in emerging economies. So, it has been agreed that a mechanism will be put in place to monitor the progress of this decision that has been taken in this particular summit every 6 months, and a global stock take of some sort, will happen in 2025, which will basically measure the progress and the achievements that that the summit will consider. So, in nutshell, a lot to watch out for as far as the climate finance is concerned, both within and outside of the UNFCCC process.
Thanks, Subrata. Saransh, let me just come to you again. What were the key areas of negotiation with respect to adaptation at Bonn, and what progress was made by the parties?
Thanks, Steffi. The discussions on Nairobi Work Program, Adaptation Committee, and the National Adaptation Plans largely focused on their review and way forward. The chair also noted with concern that as of June 2023, only 45 of the 154 developing countries had prepared and submitted a national adaptation plan or a sectoral adaptation plan since the establishment of this process way back in 2010. The developing country parties reiterated that gaps and needs remain in terms of access to financial support, technology, and capacity building. They emphasized on the responsibilities of developed countries to provide predictable, adequate, and scaled up support to developing country parties according to their commitments and previous decisions during COP26 in Glasgow, including doubling of adaptation finance. The developing country parties also highlighted the need for regional balances in the UN for NAPS program, as well as the workshops, the NAP expos, and other trainings which are organized by the Adaptation Committee and the LDC Empowered Group or LEG, so that the LDCs, the small island developing states, and other developing countries can communicate their needs for technical assistance on an ongoing basis. Major negotiations happened around the framework for Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation. Established at COP26, it is a 2-year program designed to develop a clear framework for the global goal on adaptation ahead of COP28, where it is supposed to be adopted. Over the last year, the program has held 6 workshops, with the latest one taking place at Bonn on 4th and 5th of June, just before the SB58. and focusing specifically on developing metrics, indicators, and methodologies for formally establishing the global adaptation framework. Informal consultations were then carried out over the 2 weeks of talks and discussions and negotiations, where divisions arose with Suriname on behalf of G77, China on behalf of like-minded developing countries, and India calling for the inclusion of targets as a part of the framework, with the G77 and China stressing the importance of moving into substantive discussion on targets. India argued that adaptation must be dynamic and take into account the capacity of countries to adapt and the degree of climate risks they face. India also noted that targets would be unethical unless they are absolute. The developed country parties were against the inclusion of targets, saying that enough discussions have not happened in the 6 workshops conducted on targets, and it would be too early to include them in the text. As a result of the inputs during the week one of negotiations, parties were presented with 3 options for draft conclusions in the second week, the Wednesday of the second week. These differed in a few ways. The first option, which was most popular with those in the global south, was the most substantive due to the inclusion of elements for the development of the framework and also a detailed bucket list of targets and indicators, while the other 2 options provided a great level of flexibility as they just included the possible elements of the framework without any mention of targets and indicators, and were more popular with the global north. Parties were divided on these options, with discussions continuing into the afternoon of the final day of Bonn. The SBI chair had to request parties to arrive at a compromise in order to send a larger message to the global community. Ultimately, the third option, which provided a focus on the structure of the GGA, was adopted following some arguments over the wordings and inclusion of links. And you won't believe, half an hour was spent on discussing just the inclusion of a hyperlink to the informal note, which had the bucket list of targets and indicators prepared by co-facilitators of the negotiations to informally capture the views expressed by parties on this agenda item. It was also agreed that the remaining 2 workshops under the program should focus on the development and use of targets, indicators, and metrics. Thanks.
Thanks, Saransh. Subrata, my final question is for you. Let's talk about Article 6, which is considered to be a complex agenda item. Now, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement allows countries to voluntarily cooperate with each other to achieve emission reduction targets that they set out in their NDCs. This means that a country can transfer carbon credits that it has earned from greenhouse gas reduction to help one or more countries meet their climate targets. Could you highlight on some of the developments related to Article 6 and also what can we expect from parties at COP28?
Right. Thanks, Steffi. Article 6 is perhaps, one of the agenda items that has moved from political to technical discussions. The fact that it is a bit complicated, it was obvious that many parties called for the need for rapid capacity building to enable them to contribute meaningfully to the technical discussions on the agreed electronic format with respect to the Article 6.2 discussions. Parties also agreed to develop a manual which will be a live document with illustrative examples that will assist with the development of agreed electronic format. On Article 6.2, another discussion point was authorization, and it was continuing from the discussion at Sharm. More precisely, the discussion revolved around the authorization of the ITMOs, that is carbon credits, authorization of the parties, and authorization of the entities. So lot of things are yet to be finalized as far as authorization is concerned. Besides, the timing of authorization was also one of the contentious issue that was debated aggressively by both developing and developed parties blocs. The conclusion text requests the Secretariat to prepare a technical paper without any formal status, and the process of on the process of authorization and the draft version of the agreed electronic format and the process pertaining to inconsistencies identified in the review and the data on ITMOS. Further, the Secretariat will also hold a hybrid session before COP28 to consider the technical paper, its recommendations on the above mentioned subjects that I just mentioned on Article 6.2. The Secretariat also needs to provide a rough estimate of cost associated with Article 6.2 International Registry, along with its technical specifications. So that's what really happened on Article 6.2. On Article 6.4, one of the key debating points was the consideration of avoidance and conservation enhancement activities as Article 6 activities. And this has been proposed again at COP27, which is still continuing. The decision on the inclusion or exclusion of emission avoidance will hopefully be taken up at COP28, and hopefully there will be some sort of an agreement on the same. The supervisory body on Article 6.4 mechanism declared a public consultations on carbon removal from 5th to 19 June 2023 that will allow sufficient time for subsidiary body to consider the inputs received ahead of subsidiary body's 6th meeting that will happen from 10th to 13 July 2023. Therefore, both these issues, that is the carbon removal issues and the emission avoidance issues, will be interesting to watch out at COP28. Several parties also underscored the importance of connecting the Article 6.4 registry and Article 6.2 international registry to ensure that the information on Article 6.4 emission reductions is centralized. A technical expert dialogue will be held before COP28, the outcome of which will be considered at COP28 by the Substa to facilitate deliberations on further guidance on rule modalities and procedures for the mechanism established under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. There are certain developments that I would like to highlight which really happened outside of the UNFCCC process. At the summit for a new global financing pact, a call to action for Paris-aligned carbon markets was launched, which is supported by approximately 31 countries. The key objective of this call to action is to expand and deepen the domestic carbon pricing instrument in line with the Paris goal and fully implement the agreed rule book for the international compliance market and ensure high integrity in voluntary carbon markets. Besides, France and United Kingdom initiated a process to steer a global roadmap on biocredits, that is biodiversity positive carbon credits and biodiversity certificates. The purpose would be to increase the private sector involvement and investment in natural capital by pulling together the required expertise in the space and identifying actions. So Article 6 and carbon market space will heat up leading up to COP28 is what I'm expecting, because the developments will advance both within and outside of the UNFCCC process. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashwini, Saransh, and Subrata for guiding us through the crucial topics that were discussed during the conference, which will hopefully serve as a foundation for the upcoming COP28.